So we are going to talk to our three CEOs. So this panel is called CEOs and the SDGs. And in light of everything that you've just heard and some powerful provocations from the last two speakers, thank you for that, by the way, there are a couple of themes that I'd quite like to pick up on as well. I'll introduce the panelists in a minute. My name's Lucy Siegel, and I'm a journalist and broadcaster. I primarily write for The Observer, where I've been a columnist since 2004. And I write quite a quirky column called Ethical Living. So environmental and social justice on a Sunday in the magazine, sort of packaged as more as a lifestyle kind of issue. So I have tried to introduce the SDGs to my audience, many of whom, to be completely frank, will already know about them, and some who have been instrumental in campaigning for them already. I also work in more mainstream media, if you like, so I work for the BBC as well. I work on a show called The One Show, where I have not been asked to introduce the SDGs to any of that audience. Make what you will of that. But I think it's fair to say, and I think the last speaker from Bahrain picked up on this, that there hasn't been an electrifying mass communication of these ideas thus far. So I'd be interested to hear from our panel why they think that deficit is, and if they are ready to start communicating them in their own way through their own communications channels, and why this shyness has occurred. I have tried wearing the badge. Somebody asked me why I had a Trivial Pursuit badge on. I have tried my bit. And I do think that, and I bang on about this incessantly, but as with climate change, the science and the theory is there. The crisis is not with that. Crisis is not with the science. It's with the communication. I have heard these referred to as global goals. I've heard that was because the sustainability thing wasn't flying. There's obviously 17 of them. Maybe people are confused by the idea that some will be cherry-picked. I think there's also a huge value and abundance of ideas wrapped up in them. I know this is Inspiration Day, so I just want to be inspirational, or I just want to talk about something inspirational for a moment. I think that we haven't, and I have heard this said before, seen anything like this since 1948 and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which reflected an aspirational world at the time. I think this has similar appeal and characteristics in some aspects, but obviously we're living in a very different world. And if we think about the idea, what the opportunity is here, and it's the opportunity for almost every country in the world has signed up to this, and I know there is complexity about how they will be able to prove their commitments in both the spirit and the letter, which is what you said, I think, and I thought was incredibly powerful. And also from our panelists, I'd be interested to know how you're going to embrace the goals in the spirit and the letter. But if you think of the opportunity as a global society to hold these values together, and there are mechanisms that exist with bringing people together. We have the EU, for example, which is obviously under threat with Brexit. So what is going to be the mechanism for doing that? How do we, when we seem to be drifting apart and we seem to be pursuing our own agendas, how do we do that? I also think there's a question to answer from corporations. How do people believe in what you're doing and that you can be part of this transformational coalition? We heard about the coalition that's really needed, and I would ask you to try and address some of that as well. And how are they convinced by your commitment in a way that it's not a Trojan horse to ameliorate some of the problems of globalization? So we see continued pursuit of growth, which the last speaker talked about. How can we be sure that this is true to the spirit and the letter? So those are some of the kind of, some of my thoughts about where we might go in this next conversation. So let me introduce the panel. Guys, if you can come up and sit down. I'm going to stay standing up because it's cooler, so lucky me. Okay, so Mike Walsh, as you're nearest to me, I'll introduce you first, and then I'll just run down the line. So Mike is CEO of the global legal business of LexisNexis, a leading provider of information to law firms, corporate, government, and academic markets, and journalists. I use it a lot.
Thank you.
No, thank you. He led the transformation of the business from a provider of legal research to a solutions partner, joined in 2003 as Senior Vice President, and was previously Director of Strategic Business Development at Home Depot. I think in your earlier career, you practiced law. Is that right?
True.
Okay, very good. Okay, next on our panel, we have Chet Burchett, who has been the CEO at Reed Exhibitions since January 2015. Before that, he served as the president at Reed Exhibitions for 11 years and its regional president of the Americas. Your early career was in journalism.
Yeah.
Good swap.
Print
Well
journalism.
done.
That's the best job I ever had. It was.
But you were right to get out.
I did.
Well done.
One step ahead.
Spare a thought for those of us who weren't quite so clever. Okay, and Ron Mobid was appointed Chief Executive Officer of Elsevier in August 2012. He previously headed the science and technology business there. He's a fellow of the Institute of Directors and of the Energy Institute, first degree in engineering from Trinity College, Cambridge, and a master's in petroleum engineering from Imperial. Very impressive. Okay. Yeah, it's good to have an engineer on board, I think. I don't know if you think of yourself as an engineer anymore.
Absolutely.
Yeah, once an engineer, always an engineer. Okay, so today is partly about understanding where we're starting and where we're headed. So what I'd like to do is get a brief overview from each of you to set some context. So if you can pick out the SDGs which are most pertinent to your business and give us some insight into the business at the same time, that would be great. And I'm going to start with you, Mike, because I'm looking at you.
Oh, okay.
You're going to start.
Lucky me. I got to go
Yes.
first. Okay. Yeah. Let me first give you an overview of the LexisNexis business, and then I'll talk about the Sustainable Development Goals and what we focus on in particular. Our business, LexisNexis, what we do is we provide all the information and technology tools that lawyers would use. That's our primary business, and we also serve academics, and we do serve journalists through an aggregated database of news and business information that people use. We operate in about 175 countries around the world. Our business is about $2.3 billion in revenue per year, and we have about 10,000 employees. And in terms of the SDGs, the one that we focus on most, and that's most central, is 16, which is around peace, justice, and institutions. And for us, in our business, we think about corporate responsibility and the goals as something that's not sort of separate from our business. We look at it as core and integral to what we do every day. And so if you talk to anybody in our company, they'll tell you that our fundamental mission as a business is to advance the rule of law, which is central to peace and justice. And of course, what we're in essence doing is strengthening institutions around the globe for the rule of law, to enable the rule of law to flourish. Because we can see the tight correlation between advancing the rule of law and creating a better society. And just in a nutshell, because I think it's always important to talk about what does that actually mean and how do we define it. We think of the rule of law as meaning promoting the equality under the law, so everybody's treated equally under the law, regardless of where they come from, what station in life. There's transparency in the law, so the laws are clear, precise, and there's good visibility into the laws. There's accessible legal remedy, so you have the ability to pursue justice, and an independent judiciary. And in general, the stronger these components, the stronger the rule of law. And so we think about everything in our business that we do is fundamentally oriented around advancing that, improving that, and hence supporting your goal 16.
Okay, thank you. Chet, let's hear from you.
All right. Well, Reed Exhibitions serves communities. I mean, we create physical events that engage communities around the world. We do that through more than 530 events a year. So with the exception of 1 week, there's a Reed event running someplace in the world, either starting or finishing, and some weeks there's 25 or 30. We have more than well over 7 million customers who physically come together with us as part of this. But because we serve their communities, our business and our events tend to reflect the needs that they have, the challenges they're facing, and their concerns. And so in that way, for us, engagement on a lot of these issues is very organic because it flows up from the communities that we serve, and our events actually become platforms. So, for instance, one of a very good example is the World Travel Market here in London. It's a very successful, long-held event, but for many, many years, it's also hosted World Responsible Tourism Day. And over time, that's become the single largest day of responsible tourism action in the world. And the issues that they're engaged on during that conference relate to things like the goal for decent work, for sustainable consumption, for life even under the sea. The goals that we play against or would work against are as various as the industries and the communities that we serve. There are more than 40. So if you look, for instance, if you look into the UAE, in Abu Dhabi, we run the World Future Energy Summit, which we call WFUS. And it's just in case I say that, and you go, what? We bring together government officials, NGOs, commercial leaders, opinion leaders around the idea of promoting global renewable energy and sustainable development. That's the focus. There's an additional couple of events that we run alongside. The International Water Summit that's really focused on particularly water issues in arid regions and eco-waste. Now, the power of this particular platform, it's the largest of its kind in the Middle East. There's more than 600 companies that come, that exhibit and sponsor the conference from 40 countries. But there's 30,000 people who come from 150 countries to participate in the conference. Now, these are just a couple of the larger things. But if I could, and without embarrassing, something we're really proud of is in 1998, Fiona Jeffrey, who was the chairman of World Travel Market, because of her passion, founded Just a Drop. And it's an organization that's focused on providing clean water to those most in need. And in the beginning, it came from within her role in Reed, but then it has been out on its own, although they still share a little bit of office space. I think Fiona would like to have a bit more. But the fact is this, since it was founded, it's touched the lives of more than 1.3 million people in 30 countries. Now, that wasn't a corporate initiative. To what you said, it's embedded in who we are. It was the result of Fiona's heart and those who gathered around her. We were happy to participate. It was driven by passion. Our business is driven by the passionate engagement of the communities we serve. And so I think in our capacity of doing that and doing that well, we can support the advancement of the SDGs.
Let me just ask you this. If you have a client or a big event which is actively against some of the SDGs, so I'm thinking like, I'm not saying you do this, but like an arms fair or something like that?
We don't.
You don't. So you have do you have a negative screening process? So you would not work with certain organisations that didn't take a progressive view on these goals?
We comply and adhere, but we also, I think, exercise good judgment.
Yeah.
And I won't get onto it here on stage, but if you'd like to talk about what that's like personally, I'll be happy to.
Okay, intriguing.
Because it comes at a certain cost, not just commercial, but personal. I'll just put it this way. I had a large customer who would no longer do business with us that asked, don't you know what this is going to cost you? And my point was, well, if your values don't cost you something every once in a while, they're not worth very much. So that's RELX Exhibitions, and that's RELX, I think.
It's a good response. Thank you.
I'd like to pick up on the theme that you've already heard around the sense of purpose of the people in the organisation all the way through RELX, because it seems to me, having only been in the company 6 years, that sense of purpose is what drives the ideas around the products that we create in order to service our different communities. The communities that Elsevier services are the worlds of scientific research and health. And if you want to relate back to the 17 SDGs, then clearly health is in there, advancement of scientific development around energy, around sustainable water, play very much into that. So that's clearly a very obvious connection, and we work quite hard to make sure that we understand that connection in general. The SDGs have been around a short period of time. Elsevier goes back to 1580. So we've been playing around the world of science for quite a while. We smuggled out Galileo's manuscript when he was under house arrest in Pisa to tell the world what was really happening between the planets and the sun, as opposed to what other people wanted Europe to believe. So that sense of understanding how science can change the world and scientific information can change the world is very strong. But there are other areas that we operate in beyond science and health that fit quite well with the 17 goals. So, for example, we do quite a lot of work around understanding cities and how sustainable cities can operate and how you can build strong communities in cities by giving them the infrastructure that is sustainable that they need. Some of them living infrastructure, but also commercial infrastructure. Another goal that was in the 17 is sustainable economic growth, whether it's distributed in the right way or not, we can talk about. But when we think about how science, technology, investments can generate economic growth around the world, we think we've got a large role to play. A lot of the economic developments and social developments that we benefit from today, some of which have alleviated the poverty over the last 15 years that was talked about earlier on, come from the, first of all, discovery of technologies that can help, and then the deployment, often commercially, of those technologies at scale so they actually make an impact. And GSK's drugs might be an example of that. How you build clean water systems can play into that. So technology, in our opinion, has a large role to play in economic development and in the deployment of sustainable systems. We don't disagree that policy plays a massive role as well, but I want to make sure that you've heard from me as an engineer play up the contribution or the potential contribution of technology in achieving those SDGs. And Elsevier, I think, plays quite a large role. A couple of things around what we've done practically. A couple of years ago, we did a big survey on sustainable research into sustainability, academic research. And so we produced a report in 2015 that looked at the growth of the types of academic research which are targeted towards sustainability. And we found that the growth of that area outstripped by a factor of 2 the general growth of scientific activity around the world in the period that we studied. So that's one area we looked at. We also look at another SDG, which is gender equality. And we, at the beginning of this year, published a report about gender equality or inequality in science to understand whether we were getting the right representation of women at junior, mid, and senior levels in the world of science. So those are 2 examples of how we operate practically in these areas. I think there's always a lot more to do, but I feel very confident that the motivation of our people is very much around advancing science and advancing health. And if that motivation is strong, then the work we do, the priorities that we apply, and the values that we apply will follow.
And was the scientific community getting the right balance of gender equality?
There's been enormous progress in the last 15 years, where around the world the percentage of academic researchers which were women moved from the mid-20s percent to around 40% today. So it's not 50, but it's moved dramatically in a very short period of time. And I think when we talk to the European Commission about this, they could see that although the migration from 25 to 40 was laudable, the migration from 40 to 50 is likely to be a little bit harder, but is still a target worth attacking.
There's obviously an elephant in the room as far as this panel goes, but they're all great talkers and they're very, very committed to the SDG goals. So we're going to let you off on the gender there. Okay, so I just want to pick up on one thing. Actually, when I read, and I do read from time to time, one of your reports, I get a slight oh, look at me, I'm reading this report. I hope and my forebears can see me reading this incredibly academic, peer-reviewed report. Who is your audience, And how can you help communicate? Because your audience it's rarefied. It's an expert audience. So do you have anything to bring to the party in terms of getting these goals out there?
It's a great question. We wrote the reports for the academic community, but also we tried to write it so that members of the public who were interested would be able to understand what we were saying. We also tried to summarize it so that it could be disseminated, and we work with the press quite a lot. I'm not sure if you know this, but we offer access to our scientific literature to a small number of scientific journalists around the world. We also select what we think are the top 100 scientific papers that have been produced in the last year for free for people to look at, so that we can try and push out scientific research that's interesting to the public in a way that can be digested by the public. We also try and work with scientific researchers to get them to summarize their own work, and it turns out that's really difficult. Scientific researchers very often are reluctant to précis their work or to bring it into language that the general public can understand, because they worry that the essence of the science will be lost when they do that. But we spend quite a lot of time trying to encourage them to do that. We ask them to make videos of their research. We sponsor an award in the US called the Golden Goose Award, which is trying to help people to see how academic research that sounds really outlandish and probably a waste of taxpayers' money actually brings enormous benefit. So we try in multiple ways, practically, to bring science to the attention of the public in ways the public can understand.
We've kind of arrived at communications, so I'd like to stay here because I do think it's an important issue that's kind of worth hearing about. Do you have any observations? There's sort of two elements of this question, really. One is, as far as, and I think Mike in chat, you've touched on it already, as far as CSR goes, I think you're suggesting that, well, I've heard it said that CSR in its traditional form is pretty much dead. Would you agree with that? So the kind of idea that it's all about risk is all kind of gone, and that it's now much more about pushing forward. I mean, you've taken up a very sort of noble role if you're trying to, I can't remember the phrase that you used about justice. You'll remind us in a minute. But do you have any observations on that? And also any sort of things that you're worried about, any pitfalls that you've seen before? Maybe it's around language, maybe it's about people overestimating even how much businesses can do around communicating this to a wider audience, because it seems that that is one of the basis, the central tenet, that we will know if this has succeeded if we have that mass communication, that mass appeal.
Yeah, I mean, I think you raised there's a lot in there.
Yes, I'm sorry.
And I think in terms of CSR and thinking about it, and I think, the key thing here that we think about is impact, right? And how do you have impact, and how do you have measurable impact? I think an important element of that is focus. And I think it's easy to get distracted by ranges of different goals and initiatives. And if you can really hone in and focus on some key ones and then understand why they're important and how you move it, I think that's how you have the biggest impact. And so in our work on advancing the rule of law, we've tried to be quite focused around that. And one of the key things there is to understand, well, what is it? So we spent a fair amount of time defining it, boiling it down, and making it simple. And then the question is, well, why is it important? And how do we measure its importance? And there we did some work around really understanding the relationship between the rule of law and economic and social indicators in the world. And we did some work on that. And we did some work that correlated country rule of law indexes with economic and social indicators. And there are some pretty fascinating insights that came out of that, which is that if you look at the rule of law and countries and how they score on an index, if you move that index by 10%, or if you increase the strength of rule of law around the world by 10%, statistically, GDP per capita goes up by $7,000 per person. And this is just based on statistical correlations. Infant mortality goes down by 30%. Or improves by 30%. Crime is reduced by 30%. And life expectancy increases by 2 years. And so that's a measurable impact, and it's a focused impact. So then we take that and say, okay, well, that's why this is important. Now, how do we actually move each of these levers and each of these components? And then we try to really hone in on specific things. So in terms of increasing transparency of the law as one of the components of advancing the rule of law, our database that we have a global legal database, and you talk about issues in Africa. We're the leading publisher in sub-Saharan Africa for the laws. In many cases, people couldn't get access or visibility into the laws until we're able to bring them to them. And you can't get justice if you can't get access to the law. So we have a database that's about 150 times the size of Wikipedia, and it's doubling every 3 years. And we're even working in countries like Saudi Arabia and China to build out databases for the rule, because our belief there is that it's important for every country to build out and have accessibility to the laws and make them visible. And we're going to continue to expand our resources there until we make all the world's laws accessible and visible to its people, and we measure that every year. So I'll sort of stop
But
there.
that's also a market opportunity for you, right?
It is a market opportunity, and that's why it's a particularly good thing for both us and society, because if you've got a market opportunity, then you've got an ability to sustain it, and you've got an ability to drive resources in it. You've got ability to expand it. And so I think that oftentimes if you look at goals and you find what is in the best interests of commercial opportunities, you can actually accelerate the resources that you devote to those opportunities.
How committed are you? So there's a country, a territory where you're not making headway. How long are you going to hang out there for before you cut your losses and say, at the end of the day, this is a business and we need to move on?
We see opportunity everywhere. There's
That's not quite the same point, then.
Well, every country, there is an opportunity to improve rule of law outlook, and we see opportunities to do that. So, we worked, for example, in the Maldives. Right? You might say, well, gee, the Maldives is a fairly small country, economically not large, and this past year we actually worked to gather and consolidate the laws and make those available and transparent for the first time in the country. And so now people have the ability to do that. You might think Myanmar is a case where it's a country that doesn't have vast resources or commercial opportunity per se. We worked on the ground to help the lawyers there with the first efforts around constitutional reform. And we held the first seminar there teaching lawyers the principles of Constitution and how to enact it and progress it. And it was an amazing experience to watch a room like this, as you see the mood in the room break from sort of tentative and nervous to empowered as they start to grasp the power of what the law and having an accessible system of justice can actually bring. People don't have land rights there. We're working to bring technology and legal domain expertise together to empower people to have land rights there so that they can create economic opportunity for themselves. So I'm not saying it's the only way to do it, but if you can root your activities in things that fundamentally help people improve their lives, create jobs, create sustainable economies, I believe that that's a very, very good way to approach it.
We are short of time, so I'm going to make this quick, but there's just something that I want to build on. Rule of law, how much traction does that have with the public at large, with where we think of a mass audience? I mean, we're in a time when a few months ago we saw judges on the front of one of the newspapers labelled as traitors for standing up to Brexit. Yeah. I mean, does that worry you? Do you think it has traction with a wider audience if you can prove this business values case, which you seem to have a very robust proof of?
Yeah, so yes, it does worry me. I think the erosion of the rule of law is a very, very concerning topic. And that's why it's so important to strengthen the institutions. We provide training for judges. We provide materials for courts in more than 100 countries. And it's important that we have very, very strong judicial systems and independent judicial systems, because that ultimately is our guard against, and it's a check against tyranny and authority that is not good for society. In terms of impact and widespread impact, we have tried to address that in part by leveraging and making other businesses and commercial organizations aware of and responsible for promoting and advancing rule of law around the world. And that's why we worked with then Secretary General Ban Ki-moon in launching Business for the Rule of Law initiative together with the United Nations. And what that is, it created a framework of principles that we rolled out across the world to corporations that provided guidelines for in-house counsel for how they can actually carry down those principles through their organizations. So it creates reach down through businesses and commercial organizations, which then reach people and has a broader impact. But the work is never done. And the UN estimates that 4 billion people today operate outside the umbrella protection of the rule of law. And our mission as a company is to bring that number 4 billion down to 0. So it's an ongoing push.
Okay, chat. We think that the SDGs are a good thing. How do we get, with all your understanding of how to communicate to vast audiences, how do we get them out there?
Well, I think there's a couple of things as it relates to our business, and I'm assuming that's what you're asking me to address, not a more global communications response.
Well, I'd like some hints on that would be helpful if you've got any insight.
You can tell. Well, the fact that it remains unsolved is a clue. I think that what you have to do is you have to understand the dynamic of what goes on when we run an event. All right. So whatever community that is, and we do both. We do some B2C or to consumer type events, but the majority of what we do is business to business. And so you have an enormous amount of media that is that participates in those events, and we generate by the tens of millions, sometimes hundreds of millions of media impressions out of these events. I was a public relations guy once too, and the numbers are large enough that you would have been embarrassed to say them to your client because you'd have thought he was you weren't telling the truth. But it's hundreds of millions of media impressions, and what gets reflected out of the event is what's new. All right, so part of it is that when we do something like we launch Accessibility's Expo in Dubai, we're really putting a spotlight on needs that are emerging around recognition of being able to provide accommodation, and that drives something. When we launched Thermal Energy, a brand alongside Smart Energy Week in Japan, which runs twice a year, once in Osaka, once in Tokyo, we put a spotlight on the growing role of thermal energy as a solution to power demands. But there's something else, and it's actually it's not the media coverage that comes out of the shows. I think it's the stories that go home. Last year we did global research across our business, and so I have a high degree of confidence. But the number one reason that people go to trade shows is not to sell something or buy something. It's to be inspired. And that's what our customers tell us. It's the number one reason they come is to be inspired. The largest single group of people as a group that come are what we call explorers. They're there to discover. They're looking for innovation. They're looking for the idea. Some come with problems that they're trying to solve. Others come with dreams that they're trying to realize. But 75% of our customers are small and medium-sized enterprises. They're SMEs. They're small businesses. So in terms of the communication piece, when I say we have well over 8 million or 7 million customers, the vast majority of them are neighborhood businesses. They're women and men with ideas that they're trying to get traction or problems they're trying to solve. And the degree to which these goals interact and become part of that community's concern, they go back with those stories. And so you think about the way that multiplies. So don't think of our shows as basically big monolithic events for major corporations. They really are events that serve the small and medium-sized enterprises that exist around the world. And I think there's a very good intersection of what the goals are seeking to achieve and what we're able to provide in terms of platform.
Very interesting. Could you see an SDGs like Expo? Like a massive...
Well, we are a commercial enterprise, and first of all, I need exhibitors or sponsors. But now the fact is, it's not so much an expo as it would be a conference. And there are, if you look around, if there is a topic, if it is compelling, and the people in the room are compelling, then we have an event. And what we seek to do is to make that connection. So yeah, could there be a conference built around this? Absolutely. I think that you have to make it inspire. And as I said, when people come, which is the one thing that we know, when they come to an event, when they take the time to physically travel, and this is what I think everybody needs to remember. In today's world, physical engagement, personal engagement, is a higher hurdle than it used to be, because there are passive ways, and you can, what my son says, just because you click like on something doesn't mean you have a friend, doesn't mean you're participating. But increasingly, there are passive ways of taking on information and participating in issues. Our events they're physical. So if you have a conference around this, it has a higher hurdle to get the people to come. And yet when you show up, your level of engagement is higher. So you have what we would call a qualified audience. But remember that what drives it isn't an opportunity to transact. It's an opportunity to be inspired, which I think your thematic today is good.
Very interesting. I think the fact that you're not doing it already, just to paraphrase you, is a clue as to why there's not an
Perhaps.
SDGs Expo. Anyway, thank you. Okay, Ron, I think you've got a lot of insight about communications, and you referenced that paper before that showed that sustainability in science was it twice the uptake?
Yep.
Even why is that? It would also be interesting. And what can we gain from that insight and put into communicating these goals?
Let's talk a little bit about communications in general. The specific point that I was making was that the growth of research in the topics that would loosely fall under the SDG goals, the 17 goals, that growth is twice the rate of growth of science activity in general. So over time, if that continues, then the proportion of research activity targeted at sustainable activities related to sustainability, will grow as a proportion of total science, which is only a good thing. The point about communication in general is we are, as a business, all of us are in the world of communication. That's what we're doing. We're trying to disseminate mostly technical information, legal information, if you like, is technical information, to technical users, but could also be for consumers. Having said that, I am told that the best way to communicate in a broader scale is through stories. And so what we've done on the front page of our website is not to talk about who we are and how big we are or how much money we make, how many people we've got, but it's a story. And it takes up the entire territory of the front page of our website. So if you go onto elsevier.com today, you will just see one picture of one lady on a farm, and the story behind her is how science helped her to improve her crop yields. I think the other part of this relates to the individual, because personal stories seem to me to work a lot better than group stories. I think all of us probably have personal stories around sustainability, and when we talk to our friends, when we talk to colleagues, when we talk to family, those stories can be extremely powerful. My first job was to work in West Africa. I worked in Angola and the two Congos for 5 years, and my story is that there, over 5 years, I saw at firsthand what happens when you can apply a little bit of education or training to a technician in this case, to give them a little bit of extra money so that they can take care of their family better, they can apply better medical treatment for that family so that they can thrive. And the end of that story is, apart from the thriving family and the health issues that he was able to solve when I was there, was 15 years later, an email from the same individual who's now living still in Africa, but had built a very successful technical career and was in a position where he was completely self-sufficient and was contributing back into his community. Those are the stories, I think, that make this question about the impact that Mike was talking about much more real. And for me, if you're going to talk about this and try and communicate it globally and try and inspire people to take action, it's those stories, those examples that people can use and say, well, if you can do that, if you've had that experience, I can do it too.
I absolutely agree with you that narrative is key. I think that's a really, really important point. But how do you must get some pushback, because narrative is associated not with fact always, okay? I don't want to open a whole other can of worms here at 1 minute over our deadline for finishing. But do you get pushback? Because, you're the it's all about the sanctity of the science and the paper and the peer review and all the rest of it. Do you get pushback when you start trying to tell stories?
You know, I don't think so. I think there is a place for fact and data, and there's a place for the story that brings some of the facts alive. And I think that's what we're talking about here. You actually illustrated the point. You said, well, here's a dry fact, the proportion of scientific research that goes towards sustainability. Tell me more. But the real interest is in, so what does that mean? Tell me a story about how that works. So a story around how that works is, there's a data point from the same report that said the proportion of researchers from developing countries who are engaged in research around sustainability is extremely low. The people who are doing research on sustainability are here in the UK, or in Germany, or in the US. That's where they are. They're not in the Congo. Why not? So we bring that fact out, but the story around it is how you can show on our website the story of a researcher in a developing country getting access to research, collaborating with other researchers in Europe, and being able to improve the lives of the farmers and the community around her. So the story brings the facts to life, in my opinion.
I'm just going to say thank you to our panel. I'm sorry we haven't come to an end point, but I thought it was kind of really, really good information to get from you. So thank you to Mike, to Chet, and to Ron, and thank you for listening. Thank you.